For those of you who I've talked to before, which I don't know who was in the room because it was on Zoom, this is way better because I get to see your faces. And I'm trying to mix it up a little bit. So I am using that, the Twitter, like how it started, how it's going. So I'm just gonna go back a little bit, just since we're all studying here or have studied art in some ways, to talk about where I came from. So I studied metals and jewelry design at the University of Kansas, and I got my BFA there a long, long time ago, it feels like. And I was really interested in making things in metal that weren't made out of metal. So like I was fascinated by carnivorous plants, and I was trying to take these plant forms and turn them into metal. So I made a lot of plants out of metal. And then I went to grad school. So this is a very, very short how it started story, because I can take too long on this part, so I'm going fast. So then I went to get my MFA at Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, and I studied in a program that was called Metals, Jewelry, and CAD/CAM. So that's where I started studying computer design, and I wasn't very good at it at first. So for the most of my MFA, my work is not made in the computer, and so I was just looking for ways that I could actually get more. So you can see it's similar style. I still have these like spiky, like tentacle forms, but I was looking for a material that could kind of convey some of the sticky and colorful and flexible parts of plants that were hard to convey in metal. And so I started exploring a material called silicone rubber, and I really, really enjoyed working with that stuff. It's very tricky. It's very hard to work with initially, but I think I started to explore what the possibilities could be, and really just started pushing the material as a material. And so I started moving away from jewelry objects that just kind of coexisted on the body to kind of those that would take over the body. So thinking it was no longer a symbiotic relationship, and it was kind of exploring even more of that idea of carnivorous plants. And so I started just really pushing the medium. So I wasn't necessarily thinking about, so I think it's really interesting. I'm going to talk a lot about design and the process of design and how one idea kind of moves to the next. So when I went to undergrad, I was just taking classes. And so I was exploring, some of my ideas were geometric and rectilinear, and some of my forms were more organic. And as I got more into my senior year, I started to kind of find the style that I liked to create things with. Made jewelry because I liked the scale. And then as I moved into my MFA, I started exploring, the color and the material flexibility and the potentials of that. And then really, it was just like experimentations in my studio. So when I made this piece that the person is inside of, I didn't necessarily have, number one, I didn't know if it would work at all. And number two, I just wanted to see, could I do it? I had made these bubbles, so I was slip casting silicone, which is a really terribly wasteful process, and I don't do it anymore because it's too expensive and too wasteful, but I just needed to have this idea, and I'm like, I just need to solve it. And so I made these brooches that stuck on the body, and then I made this bubble wrap piece, and then I made this body bubble by just taking and making a giant mold and filling it with rubber and letting that drip out. So I just had the skin. So this piece doesn't even exist really without the person inside of it. So it's very performative, it's conceptual, but not really conceptually motivated. So people, there's a lot to talk about. It really kind of challenged the jewelry and metals field because they put it on the cover of Metalsmith magazine one time, and people hated it because it wasn't metal and it wasn't really jewelry. And so it made a lot of people angry. So I had a really interesting opportunity to kind of see what real world criticism is like after grad school by like reading some listservs where people were talking about it, and I recommend that you stay away from those. It's no longer constructive or supportive. It gets kind of nasty. So anyway, because of that stir that I didn't intend to make, they took the Mint Museum of Craft and Design has this bubble wrap piece because the body bubble doesn't really exist. So they took that and acquired it because of the conversation that it started. So it's really interesting, I think, to think about if you're just doing what you want to do because you want to do it, sometimes things happen. But I think the more I try to make work that that I think people will want to see, sometimes that falls flat. So I think you really have to kind of create your work from an authentic place and see where it goes. And so that's my moral of what happened with my MFA and after. And so then I went and I got my first teaching gig, full-time, tenure track. I taught at Winthrop University in South Carolina, and I was the metals and jewelry program coordinator. Was the only faculty in that area, so it was a small school. There was a bigger art program, but no, not other tenure tracks. So I hired an adjunct once we grew a little bit to teach one class in the metals and jewelry, but I was teaching all levels, all stacked. So we had levels. We had level one that was in one class, the intro class, and then everything else was they all met at the same time, and I had students who just kept signing up for that class and coming in and taking it. I found it very hard to make work for a number of years. So there's a big gap in my making from when I graduated with my MFA to when I started trying to figure out what to make when I was teaching too. And so it was hard. It was hard to find the space and figure that out when teaching so many different things that I was kind of learning on the fly as well. So I started to kind of think about my surroundings. I started making work kind of thinking about the suburbs, but again, connecting to that plant. Even when I had different subject matter, there was something in the form language that always held it together. So I was thinking about different things than carnivorous plants. I was actually thinking about the suburbs and domestic life because I'd bought a brick house in a 1950s brick suburban ranch, and I was thinking about those things, but yet for some reason my work still had kind of a similar quality, even though I was now using baking pans to cast the rubber into instead of, these are little brioche pans, and then turning them into rings. So I was thinking about stuff about where I was living. So it was just, I was influenced by that. So there's a lot of color, it got very poppy. And I was having more fun with the work than I was in grad school, which I think is good, because I think there's a lot of pressure when you're making stuff in grad school. You feel like it should be very important. The professors say that it needs to change, it needs to do something different than they've seen, and that's a lot of pressure. So I just wanted to make things, and I had fun with that. And these have been collected too, so I don't have them anymore. I've learned the importance of photography, going back to my work from undergrad, all that stuff sold, and I had taken really terrible pictures of it, so I don't show it a lot because I wasn't very good at photography, and I'm still not, so now I hire people to take pictures of my work because I'm not so good at that. But then, so I left Winthrop University in 2014, I guess. So I took a year leave. My husband got a job at SUNY New Paltz, which is State University of New York at New Paltz. And they have a strong art program, and they wanted him. And so I said, well, you should do that, and we should go. And at that time, I had a not yet 1-year-old and not yet 3-year-old. And so I was like, well, you go, I'll stay here. And then I realized what that would actually look like. And so I decided, okay, I'll take a year leave and I'll come too. And in that time, I taught just one class that year, which was kind of a nice, if I'd have realized it was a short break, I thought maybe that was the end of my academic career, which I really did enjoy. But I had gotten tenure at Winthrop, and then I'd left. And so people were like, are you crazy? And I was like, no, I think we just need to do this. And then I actually applied for jobs in the New York City area and was super surprised to get one at Seton Hall University, which is a small, you've probably heard of it, but if you like basketball, it's a Catholic school. And they have a little art department. And so I went in there, there's no metals program. So I was teaching very different stuff. I was teaching a sculpture class, which was really just a 3D design class, but if they called it that, no one would take it. And then I was teaching intro to 3D computer graphics, and then I got to make up some classes. So it was kind of a fun opportunity, but I started to think about what now. And at that time, my work had kind of moved away from jewelry, right? It wasn't jewelry anymore, and I was thinking, well, what can I do? What can I do? I want to do things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the body. So I started kind of transitioning away from that and thinking about art, thinking about, there's these different kind of niches of art. Jewelry is a very small community. You go to the annual jewelry conference, and it's the same 300, 400 people, and you know them very well, and they have the same conversations, and they make work for each other, and that's the circle that people keep in. And then I started going to this larger conference, SIGGRAPH, which was Computer Graphics and Interactive Techniques. And the reason that I got pulled in there is because of the CAD CAM that I'd been doing in grad school. And so I was really more just interested in learning what they were doing there. And it was all sorts of things. So it's AR, it's VR, it's game design, it's animation, it's digital fabrication and kind of making spaces, like physical computing and all sorts of stuff. And so I was really interested in that, and I think it started to influence where my ideas were going. And so I started thinking about my work and what it was that I actually wanted to make. And also being at Seton Hall, you know, I've been this academic artist now for a while, and so there's lots of thinking about, you know, the theory of what you're doing and why you're doing it and where it fits into a larger context. And so I had opportunities to give talks. One time I was giving a talk in Japan, and the theme was, I was asked to talk about, was it the Digital Content Association of Japan? And I got that opportunity because of my involvement with SIGGRAPH. And I'm trying to remember the theme of the talk, but it was something about the future of art and content. And I was like, what does that even mean? Like, where do I go with that? And I'm like, I guess I'll just talk about my work. And so I started talking about my work and really thinking about, well, what do I make? And so I thought, okay, I make art because I have this, you know, it's this, in this kind of definition, it's the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. So it's usually a visual form of sculpting or something. So I'm like, okay, that's what I do. But then it's more than just that. I make objects. So I make objects because I think of them as, a lot of times my art has a function, another function. So it's like, if you look around, I've got trivets, like, you know, or doilies, and I've got baskets and a puzzle, and, you know, so there's these different things that my art could be. I like thinking about units and multiples and things like that. So I decided to start to call my stuff art objects. And then, you know, it's a thing, it's something presented to the senses. So I'm like, okay, this seems like a safe space. So I'm gonna go with that. And then as I was thinking about the proposal for this show, I was thinking about what else, you know, what else? Okay, so what would I call this grouping of these things that I've created over this time? And then that useful kept sticking in my mind. And so I held on to that because it's able to be used for a practical purpose or in several ways. And I liked that it was kind of this idea that things could have this meaning and also maybe this other function, but they could also be very differently meaningful to somebody else. These kind of plural, I talked a lot about plural realities when I was in Japan. And so like my head kind of was in this weird space. So as I've been thinking about my work and where it exists in the world, and what I want people to take from it, that's kind of where I've been. And I worked with a former grad student. She's just finished her MFA, Leila Eldana, and she's a fantastic graphic designer. She had this whole career as a graphic designer before she came to Texas A&M to do her MFA. And so I asked her to help me with the design for this show. And she actually helped me realize some things about this work after I'd already put it all in a collection. So I loved like having her look at the stuff and then say, okay, well look, you've got these kind of repeated motifs. So I realized that I'm only using like a couple shapes. So if you look around the space, we have circles, we have the hexagon, and then we have some rectangles and squares. So it's really, really not much more than that. And so I started thinking about that and started thinking about how these things could go together. And when I did propose the show, I had more new work. Well, just it was a smaller collection of work. Let me see, what else was I going to talk about? But then I pulled, and I'm going to talk about a piece behind everybody in a few minutes, but that really draws back. So I started at Seton Hall thinking about that. Where is my work? What is my work? How does it fit? What do I call it? And there are lots of different ways to categorize, work in genres. They also have this layer of intellectual intrigue. So there's this meaning behind the work that people will hopefully take something from and continue to think about later. Like, I just hope that it resonates with people, like what it's about. And so this is the first show, and I'd love feedback from everybody after I talk here. I'd love to hear what you think, because I didn't actually give really long descriptions of these pieces on the wall like I have done in the past. I have provided way too many words to go with my work in the past, and this time I did not do that. So I'm going to explain some of the pieces that are in this gallery today, and talk about how they came to be, and the data that was used was the only thing that was on the label. So I was hoping that you would draw your own connections between the form, the shapes in the form, and the data, and not necessarily need to know exactly where that fits, because I was wondering if that is really important to people or not. And so this was kind of an experiment, this show. So I've done iterations of some of these pieces, because I find that they're not always done. So if you put a piece up and you show it, sometimes you're like, okay, that was good. But then maybe I can do another arrangement. Maybe as we entered the pandemic, I wasn't feeling quite as colorful. So I was like, maybe I can change the color scheme and tone down the hues and go with these kind of earth tones and darker colors. So I've done this piece. This is Clever on Sunday. This is the first piece that I ever created with this data materialization process. And I've worked with my collaborator, Susan Reeser. She's in the New Media program at University of North Carolina at Asheville. And we met at a Computing in the Arts workshop that was hosted or funded by the National Science Foundation and Wake Forest University. I think that's where we met at first. I think that's where we were. We also did it at College of Charleston and University of North Carolina, Asheville. But anyway, I had this idea, and she's like, I'd love to work with you on that. So she's the computer scientist behind all this. So she writes my code, and I kind of tell her, I'm like, here's what I needed to do. And she's like, okay, I can do that. And she'll give me something, and then sometimes we need to tweak it. But she helped me with this. And what we were doing with these is taking data. And so she writes these. We're using processing. So I now know how to edit my code. I still cannot write this from scratch. So I've gotten much better at like figuring some things out, and I know how to change some things, but yeah, I can't start from zero. And so what we're doing is we're taking data sets of something conceptual, and then we're turning it into a form. And in the case of Clever on Sunday, this is another gallery where it was shown. I was inspired by this advertisement for Tupperware from, I don't remember the date, is I think the late 1950s, maybe early 60s. But looking at this fantastically clever or smart housewife who has been very efficient and gotten all the food prep done for the week and packed it in this Tupperware. And I was just thinking about women and working mothers and women who have gone through, because Susan is a computer scientist and an engineer, we think a lot about the proportions of the gender balance in STEM fields and different places. Computer graphics is another one of those. So if you go to SIGGRAPH, you're one of, for a while it was very, there weren't very many women there, but it's getting better. So I was just thinking about all of these things, and so we pulled data from this particular infographic that I redesigned was from data from the National Science Foundation on PhDs held by gender in the sciences. So there's a whole, I think I'm up to 7 data sets, or they're basically just statistics that draw these patterns up. And some of them, my sister's a lawyer, and so we looked at women who study, and so how many women graduate with terminal degrees or high level degrees in certain areas like medicine and law, and even in academia, and then how many achieve like full partner or full professor with tenure or these different levels, and there's these discrepancies, and so that's what this data is about. And so it's about gender balance or lack of gender balance in STEM and professional areas, having to do with education, patents, like I did patents, I think is one of them, and so there's a whole bunch. And then in the past, it's tricky the software and the apps keep changing, so at one time I had these set up So you could scan them like QR codes, and you could actually go back to the data sets. The data is all still on my website, and you can go to it and click on the image, but the scanning has been hard to sustain over multiple iterations and multiple years. So the application that I was using was called Layer, like AR for augmented reality, and it's no longer supported. And so there's some issues with technology. So these are not scannable right now, but at one time they were, which was kind of a fun, when I showed them in Montana, you could scan them and then see the data. At one time the first time I ever did them was at the Dorsey Museum in New Paltz on the campus of SUNY New Paltz. And I was invited to an exhibition called Made for You. And it was about kind of custom contemporary design. And there was a curator who organized the show or curated the show. Her name is Jennifer Scanlon. She's in Oklahoma City now. She was in New York then, but now she's here. So we'll have to connect her, get her. I wrote her and she's like, oh, I haven't made it to Ada yet, but she maybe can come down. But she's a curator in Oklahoma now. So she hosted the show, but then looking at this, I'm like, oh, I did this one, and then I'm like, there's something off about the circles, and so I started kind of changing. I was thinking about Venn diagrams and how things overlap, but I think that was a better idea than actual execution. But I was able to get this table. If you remember the table from the ad, this is the tulip table by Knoll, and so I actually living in New York has its perks, so I just called Knoll and their design studio or their showroom, and I said, can I borrow that table? And they said, sure. And so they said, just come get it. So I had to drive to Manhattan and pick it up, and they just handed it to me, and then I just returned it when the show was over 6 months later. It was kind of crazy and awesome to just be able to do that, because I was like, what are they, they're probably gonna say no, but they were like, oh no, you can borrow it. I guess they have display ones, so that was kind of fun to be able to do that. So anyway, this is the piece that started the data materialization. And since then, I've done several others, which are here in this show. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them, but not as much as I just talked about that first one. So Modern Dowry is the Teapot. It's a little bit different than the other stuff in the show, but again, functional. This was one of another early data materialization pieces that I did. So I started that in 16, and then this was 17. I was invited. So when you get invited to do a show, it's kind of awesome. It's like getting a homework assignment in class. So it reminds me of being a student. So Janine Foligno was the curator that invited us to, I was part of a group of silversmiths and metalsmiths and other artists. Kiki Smith was in the show, which was kind of exciting, to go to the Museum of the City of New York, and we got to look at the collection of colonial silver that they had there. And our charge was to make something contemporary that was inspired by a specific object. So you had to pick an actual piece. You couldn't just be like, oh, I'm inspired by the show. I've done that before too, but this one I had to pick. So I picked a teapot. And I picked the teapot because I was teaching computer graphics at this time. And the teapot is a really, really significant object in the realm of computer graphics, as well as silversmithing. So as a silversmith, everybody kind of goes through a rite of passage, like you make a teapot. It's kind of the thing you do. I had not done mine yet. Mine cheats because I use CAD. And it's silver plated. I did not silversmith it, but what I did was I connected my interest in the digital to my interest in the traditional and silversmithing, and I brought my two worlds together through my teapot, inspired by this teapot. So the Utah teapot was the first 3D object that was created to display renderers, so like shaders and surfacing, and it was a perfect object because it had both convex and concave curves. And it's kind of an inside joke now in the nerdy world of computer graphics, and it's hidden, and it's an Easter egg in many, many different places. It's been in Homer Simpson in the Treehouse of Horror, when he entered the 3D space. It's in the Toy Story, and it's in lots and lots of different places. So you can see everybody in computer graphics knows about this teapot. And so I thought, okay, well, what can I do? So I was inspired by this idea of the silver also being kind of like a bank account, right? So in colonial America, they did not have bank accounts. What you owned was your wealth. It was your inherent wealth. And when someone got married, like when a daughter got married, the family passed on certain objects of their collection to her to start her family. And it was not referred to in colonial America as a dowry, but it's similar to, if you've heard of a dowry, it's like this, you know, what you start your marriage with. And I was thinking about how, well, nowadays, we kind of like to start in the negative. I don't know about you, but I had a lot of student debt, and I married somebody who had a lot more student debt, and we also bought a house, and then, so there was lots of debt in the negative, so I was kind of inspired by that. And so I thought about taking some numbers, and I basically took different categories of debt that I had, like my mortgage, my credit card, my car, my student loans, and then this small amount of savings that I had to counterbalance that. And so I repeated that value around, and I just created this kind of concave and convex curve as a footprint for this teapot. So the concave are the debts, and the convex is the same number repeated around just to hold the thing together, because otherwise it would fall apart. And then that created my modern dowry. And so in this data materialization, another thing that has to happen is you have to make a lot of kind of tweaks to things. Like you can see that like my footprint kind of isn't it's not a perfect representation of the data. Like in some ways you have to kind of wiggle things around and almost curate it in order to make it actually work as a 3D object. So there's a lot of kind of tweaking and we call it curation that I have to do. And then also some design decisions that go along with it that don't have anything to do with the data. Like what is the spout gonna look like? And what is the handle gonna look like? And do I wanna kind of tip it backwards so it's more dynamic? And just different design decisions that come along with it. And so I sketch a lot, and then I go back to the computer and try to make it look like that. So there's kind of a back and forth between how I work digitally and then how I print things out, I draw on them, I draw next to them, and then I kind of go back and model it. I tried different modeling software, has different algorithms that run like certain things like creating connections and surfaces. And so I had to play with multiple software packages. So I tried one called Rhino, which works really well in some ways, but then Fusion 360 was one that worked in a better way in some ways. And so depending on the object that I'm making, I have to pick the software that works best. And so it's not always one size fits all for that. And then I worked with a company in Brooklyn that could plate it. So I 3D printed it, which I found kind of perfect conceptually because like, you know, a lot of people, you can't look at someone now and say, oh, that person is in a great amount of debt, right? You can hide that, like you can use credit cards. And so the kind of valueless core of the plastic, there's no inherent value in that 3D printed plastic, but then you can coat it with precious metal and have it look shinier than, and seem more valuable than in reality. So that's the teapot. For the same show, I was asked to make another piece, and I was inspired by, I don't have a picture of it, I should have put a picture of it in, some embroidery hoops that had some engraving on them from colonial America or New York. And so I created my own using, and if you've read some of these are all inspirational quotes from women who I admire. Some I know personally, like my mom and my friend Myra. And then some are just artists, and Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, has a quote on there, just people that I admire, Grace Hopper. So again, connecting my computing background or interests, I guess, and my art interests and my personal life in this kind of, in these silver embroidery hoops with these quotes engraved on them. This is the first time I ever included text in a work. I've never worked that literally before, so I haven't done it since. It's tough, it's tricky. Like text is an interesting thing to play with, and you know, it goes, it's also inspired by this 1950s sewing manual for the Singer sewing machine, which actually says, you know, prepare yourself. So the title comes from this book where they're like, well, prepare yourself for sewing. Like, make sure that you look good. So if somebody's gonna come to the door, make sure that you don't have dirty dishes in the sink so you can focus on the task. Like, there's all this advice in this book that I found really funny, and so that's where I pulled the title from. And then metalsmithing kind of being a traditionally male-dominated field of work and kind of combining those. So there's a little bit of gender, kind of questioning gender norms in that one as well. And making. So I also wanted to show the way that I plotted out how to, when I had these on display at the Museum the Museum of the City of New York, they mounted them and took care of the vitrine, so they were behind like this nice case. And then when I got them back, they were just all loose. So I had to figure out how to display them for this show. And so that display was what I had to come up with, and I had to figure out. I used CAD to plot out the holes and where I needed to drill the holes to put the little clamps in and things like that. So I just thought I'd show for fun. The pins were just these interesting, like they were from the sewing section, which I found interesting at Michael's. And I had to bend them with pliers to get them to hold on, but they were just like a double-sided pin. Anyway, if you care about that. For the students, when you're thinking about how to hang your work, like, so you can make these things and then you're like, what do I do with them now? Like, I could put them on a table or I could just lay them out. And so this piece, if you look at the date on this one, this is from 2011. I hadn't thought about this piece. This piece had been in a box in my son's room. So I made this the year he was born. It was long before I had even any idea that I was going to work with the data materialization. So it's not data, but it's maps and it's pattern, and it's about location. And so I actually thought, well, I could include this because, again, it's like it relates formally the shape, the hexagon. So I pulled this one. So this is a span in the gallery. It all of a sudden became a span of 10 years work. But I made this in collaboration with a colleague of mine at Winthrop, who's a photographer, and he was from New York, and he had, we were both in South Carolina, neither of us from there, and so we had our children, but our children were born there, and so we were thinking about where we're from and where we consider home, and so we used maps, and I used this, there's a really fun pattern software called Repper, and it's an application, and if you haven't played with it, you should, because there's a lot of things that I've done in here, and I can point you to it at the end. But we used maps, and we created patterns, like kaleidoscope patterns with the maps, and then overlaid them on images of our children, and then created these puzzles by, what do you call it when you put an image on a surface? It's like, I'm thinking of there's a more sophisticated term than the Mod Podge, like, what's the name of it? Does anybody know? Decoupage? Is that, yeah. That's it. That's why it's Mod Podge, right? That's why. Yeah, so it was nicer than that. The medium, we used, matte medium to put them together and laser cut. And then in the situation where we had them, we put a sign out, and I didn't do that here because I was a little worried with COVID, and it's not the kind of time where you want to encourage people to touch things in a public space. But at that time, we said, please play. And what happened was really interesting. People actually sat down and created little sculptures and structures with this, and so they kind of made it a little bit interactive with these puzzles. So there's that. And so that one was, I decided to include it because it related, and it pulled together actually this piece, which I wasn't sure if I was going to put in or not, but I'm glad that I did. So this piece was created very site specifically for another museum. And it was, has anyone ever been to the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania? It is a very strange place. It is, if you can see it in the back there, it's a huge cast concrete building that was built by Henry Mercer, who was a wealthy kind of, he had a wealthy family. He started the Moravian Tile Works Pottery Company in Pennsylvania, and also was just an avid collector of American pre-industrial tools and objects, domestic objects. So this place is packed full of tools and objects. And I was invited as another one of those group exhibitions where you're invited to survey the museum and take something from it and make something new. And so I was really just fascinated by the collections and these different categories. So every room had a theme. And so there were brooms, like there was like an entire room of brooms, and then an entire room of kitchen utensils, and an entire room of guns and weapons, and then woodworking tools. And so I was kind of thinking about categories. And also there were all of these mosaics sprinkled throughout that were about labor. So it was about making. The building itself was concrete, so I decided to explore concrete. And so I decided to cast these tiles. And so what I did was thought about the form, and the hexagon being a very efficient shape found in nature and also efficient in geometry. So it's kind of connecting math and nature. But I just took the categories and I asked for some data on the number of objects in the collection. So this is really simple data. I just said, how many total items or artifacts do you have in the whole museum? And then I just compared from the category of baking tools, that percentage was what I used of 100, right? And so you can see I used baking, textiles, baskets and broom making, gunsmithing and weapons, metalsmithing, woodworking, and agriculture. So I just took those samples of the collection and I created these objects, these tiles, again, because the connection of the tiles. So I kind of really literally was inspired by the museum. And so that's where I came to for this piece. But they had these, in these hallways, they had these very drab places where windows used to be. And the windows were no longer, and they were recessed areas. And so I created these, there were 7 tiles, so the one side has just 7, and the other one is the kind of collection. And I wanted to create these window insets. And so they were there for a year, which was great. But then when I got them back, I'm like, oh, what do I do now? I created this thing that was very specific for this location. And now there's like, I didn't know what to do. So I had help, but we made this frame for it, and now it's a very heavy thing we can hang on the wall with French cleats, as we found out here as we set this up. But that is work that I made up until the pandemic. So there's a few other things in here that I'd like to talk about, and I know I'm taking a while, so I'll talk fairly quickly. But the pandemic has been interesting, and switching jobs was also interesting. So right after this show, we moved from New York to Texas to take positions in the Department of Visualization at Texas A&M. At the time, and it is still, but it's been very weird since we got there, but the program sounded perfect. So basically the Department of Visualization has computer science and art in the same place. So our students do game design, animation, interactive design. Some of them develop tools for animation or the creative industry. So we have this really strong art and design foundation, and then students kind of have a blend of their hybrids. So they have technical skills, and they also have aesthetic or creative skills, and they are able to speak the creative language and also the technical language. And so I thought that sounds perfect in my interest with SIGGRAPH and what I'm doing. So we switched schools again, which is also disruptive. So then again, there was this pause. We just got there. I hadn't really set up my studio. And then in my second semester, was that same for you? Yeah, my second semester there, like the world turned upside down and the pandemic hit. So we just had my friend MK Haley. She was a Walt Disney Imagineer. So she did theme park design for 27 years at Disney. She was in research and development. So she if there was an animatronic behind something at a Disney theme park, she was probably part of developing that. She's a fantastic person. I know her from SIGGRAPH. She came to speak at our research symposium just last week. And she was talking about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and like how in order to be creative, like to get to this idea of self-actualization, which is where creativity happens, you have to have all these, although it's, there's some controversy in whether or not this is like sound psychology, I don't know, but just, it made me think about that, about how, mostly she said, we are hovering right about here. So how can we be expected to, we're all doing great. Like, and so I started thinking about, how, yeah, it's been hard. It's been really hard to make things and feel creative, but yet there's pressure to keep doing your job. And at my school, I actually had to remind my department head that there was a pandemic and that should be acknowledged in my annual review and all of our annual review. And he was like, oh, you're right. And then he went back and redid them all because they were just like, we're just supposed to act like everything's fine when things are not fine. You all know that, right? Like, we were homeschooling, virtual schooling children who wanted nothing to do with that. Can you see them there? This was one of those early homeschooling days. And this was my other job, right? Like, I'm trying to do my work. So instead we decided to embrace it. We learned how to embroider. This is my daughter's embroidery work. We planted a garden. We then made the mistake of adopting puppies that would then destroy the garden. They did, they ate everything. Everything. And so I started thinking, I put my own slide in because it was a little easier to see, but I'm like, yeah, like we're not quite there. And so maybe we should be kind to ourselves and accept the fact that, we're doing all right for the circumstances. And so I'm just gonna show a little bit of what I've done since the pandemic. So this piece, Susan and I really collaborated on. There's no way I could have created this without her. Like, I really leaned on her, but I was able to say, okay, here's what I need it to do. This is a pandemic piece. It's very specific. Actually, it was made a year ago, which I can't believe. So the data stops on the form at October 20th of 2020. So it's using, Susan and I together have family and have lived in several states. And so these arms are from the different states that we've lived in. And then there was like the rate of the increase and then the number of hospitalizations or there's some data, I have notes in here, but I forget exactly what we did, but we ended up creating this, and then this animation kind of is a timeline. So it starts out blue, kind of like if in January, we were like not aware. And then as things started kind of ramping up around spring break of March of 2020, that's when you get the blue, or that's when we turn from blue to red. And so the red is kind of alarmist. The yellow comes in when the vaccines were announced that they were going to be approved. And then these, the kind of fuzzy dots are actually the number of COVID deaths that are happening each day that fade in and out. And then the purple blobs those are the number of cases. So the black speckles are the number of cases. The purple blobs are the vaccines by state. And then they kind of morph together, and so they kind of acknowledge, and this is not up to date, this is an older one, I did not download the most recent one, but we're able to kind of update this all the time still, and it's still changing. So it's kind of the closest thing to kind of data visualization and animation that I've done. And then when it goes black and then the white dots, those are deaths by 750 deaths are 1 star. And so there's like a moment of silence at the end of that. But I think it's already gone through, so I'll go to the next one. But this is how the data looks like when we were drawing it. So Susan gave me these arms and these kind of different shapes, and then I do the drawing to kind of figure out what's that going to look like, and then we talk about what the imagery is going to be together. And then it got tweeted by the New York Times, a journalist at the New York Times, not the New York Times Twitter site, but she's with the New York Times, which I thought was kind of exciting. So we wrote them and we're like, we used your data. And they were like, oh, great. And then they shared it, which was kind of awesome. But they put that data out. And then, so that was the piece that I made about the same time that I was making these. And I made these for a show about the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So this is the one where I pull political data. So basically, I just took data of demographics. So the makeup of the 116th Congress, which at that point, and I don't know if this year or if this one is more or less, I actually need to look that up. I maybe need to do another piece. But it was the 116th at that time was the most diverse in US history, but I wanted to draw that. So that's what this became